on the cloud if that's okay. All right. Well, welcome everybody. It's really my great pleasure to introduce Jesse Ribot, who is a professor at the School of International Service at American University in DC. Jesse, as you can see, is also an artist. He's many things. So on this first screen here, he has a picture of some beautiful artwork, which he may or may not mention in his talk. He engages in so many different ways with academics and much beyond that as well. He's very well known, as many people might know, for his work influencing environmental governance and climate change governance. For example, the paper on theory of access that he co-authored with Nancy Peluso has been cited, thousands of times, and has inspired so much research and many PhDs, to the point that there was a special issue that that was written based on a theory of access 15 years later, to sort of review all this work that theory of access papers inspired. So today, I think we're really fortunate to hear some of Jesse's latest thinking on this idea of access, and why thinking about access is so important to questions of environmental justice. So without further ado, I'll hand the floor over to Jesse.
Thank you, Connie. And I want to also thank the organizers of the Conservation and Development Speaker Series for inviting me. It's a strange time to give lectures in the time of COVID. And while I've been teaching online, I have not been giving lectures. So this is a new experience, and it's very nice to see everybody. It's good to be thinking about coming back to the social world. So the talk I'm giving today is called Access Failure, Explaining Climate-Related Migration in the Sahel. And the problem I want to talk about today is really causal analysis. What is causal analysis? And in particular concerning crises that are climate related. So how do we broaden and deepen this thing we call causal analysis? And all of you should be thankful that I'm not going to go through some 20 pages I wrote trying to write a little bit of an introduction, even though I come to this introduction feeling like I'm leaving so much of the heart of these matters out. The truth is, it's all present in the background, I realize, and will emerge as we go along. Not all of it, but pieces will come out in a later article that I'm writing called Cause and Blame in the Anthropocene toward a sociodyssey of climate change. Sociodyssey being the analysis of cause that is wed to the notion of social cause. So, as you all know, natural scientists and climate advocates still, and I think quite shockingly, use hazards models to explain disasters as the outcome of weather. Now, I'll get to what that is a little bit later, but through his study of hunger and famine in the 1970s, Amartya Sen showed that disasters are caused by many factors that prefigure any weather event. He gave us tools for seeing how crises are produced by social and economic relations. Sen helped us denaturalize disaster, as it were, showing its social roots. Using what he called entitlements and capabilities approaches, Sen showed that hunger and famine are not caused by absolute shortage. Rather, they're caused by distributional failures, often the result of well-functioning markets that allocate food away from the hungry. Crises are caused by failure of people to have the entitlements, that is, assets and means required to support capabilities with which to attain desired outcomes, or to attain even the most basic needs. He calls these crises entitlement failures, moments when people cannot legally attain their basic needs through ownership or trade. Now, most people are familiar with this material, but Sen's entitlement approach has an important limit. It focuses on attaining things to which people have title or legal rights. Focusing on legal rights or title is certainly good for prescription, as law is an instrument of change. But this legal focus only partly explains why these outcomes occur. An entitlement failure is a failure to attain via title, the root of the word entitlement, the morally necessary outcomes that sustain healthy and dignified life. But the causes of crisis include much more than failures within the legal realm of ownership or within the realms of production and exchange. So while one may go hungry due to an entitlement failure, there are many other reasons that one fails to have the capabilities needed for dignified and healthy life. The causal factors that both entitlements and capabilities approaches leave out reside within what I classify as the illegal and the non-legal realms by which people attain flows of benefits. This comes out of Nancy Peluso and my work on access theory. People access basic needs and other benefits, not only by the law, but by tort, theft, violence, that is the illegal. And they also gain access via identity, relational, and structural factors that may be beyond the law. And that is what I'm calling the non-legal. Access theory, which Nancy and I developed in the 90s, includes a full range of legal, illegal, and non-legal means of attaining benefits. Benefits that range from basic necessities to excesses of accumulation. So while Sen is focused on the lack and failure, access theory can also attend to accumulation and having and gaining. The original idea of access theory was to go beyond property-based or rights-based analyses of distribution, as so many of our colleagues at the time we were writing this originally were totally obsessed with property rights and land tenure. And there are still good reasons to be obsessed with those things. So let me just go to slide 1 for a second here. And I'm not going to go into slide mode yet. Sorry about this situation, but in fact, I'm going to have to move you all so I can see what I have here. Property rights. Property basically is defined as the right to the flow of benefits from things, where rights are enforceable claims, enforceable by law, custom, or convention. Access we defined as the ability to benefit from things, where ability is implicit in the achievement of an outcome. It is having the ensemble of means, that is material, knowledge, and rights and powers to achieve that outcome. Okay? Access is thus broader than property. Property rights is one set of means of attaining access, and you have to add to that the non-legal and the illegal, as I just mentioned earlier. So basically, note that it would be easy to mistake this concept of ability with Sen's notion of capabilities. But capabilities are the means to arrive at a minimum set of outcomes in order to set a moral imperative for intervention to ensure that these minimums are attained. Capabilities are, in this sense, instrumental. They are prescription and a damn good frame for that prescription. So capability is very useful. Access is about causality and explanation. It is about why people do not have or have what they need or want. So it's more of an empirical mode of investigation. So access, or the ability to benefit, is the outcome from which we empirically trace cause. It is not a moral imperative on which we base mandated guarantees. Rights, such as ownership inscribed in title or entitlement, may enable some access as they are only one kind of access mechanism. This is a small part of the story of access. So when my good friend Christian Lund, who just published a brilliant new book called 9/10 of the Law, talks about possession, he should also explain that while possession may be 9/10 of the law, law may only be 1/10 of access, and we need to attend to that other 9/10. But the truth is, the portion that law is of access is an empirical question, and it is different in case by case. In some places, access may be entirely by violence. In others, it may be entirely by law. But by including theft, violence, and the structural, access is simply a broader way of talking about the benefits that flow from things. And that means things tangible and intangible. Things like the ability to recite the Quran may be less tangible than things like having food on your table or having a tractor. So property has to be put in place. I call this putting property in place, among other mechanisms, in order to have a full analysis of the causes of any humanly valued outcome, gains or losses. So when people cannot get what they need or want, I call it now, this is what I'm developing, access failure, okay? Access success exists as well. It's when you get what you want, and access can explain that as well. This is broader than Sen's entitlement failure. It captures a broader set of causal elements. The case I present today of climate-related migration from the Sahel toward Europe is an analysis of access failure. So onward to the case, I hope that all these issues emerge clearly in the case, if not explicitly stated. So I'm going to move this into presentation mode. And that means I can't see you, unfortunately. If only I knew how to use these things, but there we go. So, wow, I now see that you appeared, all of you. That's great. So basically, I'm going to look at the case of cotton and of charcoal in Senegal, and I'm going to look in a very shallow manner at them. These are cases that I could speak for a week about each, but that's not the story I want to tell. So this project on migration began with the sinking of a boat on April the 19th, 2015, off of Lampedusa. There were 729 young men on this boat. There were 29 survivors. Most of them were locked into the hull. Many of these people came from eastern Senegal, Tambacounda, where I've done my fieldwork, and I went to interview their parents to talk to them about why did they leave? Why did they, in fact, take the enormous risk? What did they in fact, need or lack, as it were, that put them in this situation. And one of the hardest things that came up during this was that when I spoke to these families, they did not know, what had happened on the sea. They didn't know. All they said was, they tell me that my son is at the bottom of the sea. And this is really difficult research to do in that sense, that this is very real, very deep, and people actually, many of them knew the risk. More people die crossing the desert than crossing the Mediterranean, but we hear about the people crossing the Mediterranean. They leave early in the morning or at night, and they're discovered that they're gone in the morning, these young men, and their parents set out to figure out where they went. And they know. They call the next day after the kids are gone. And they're in there, I say kids, they're anywhere from 15, well, as low, I've seen 12-year-olds go, but up to 35, generally speaking. I'm not going to show the animation, sorry. Come on, skip it. Go to the next slide. So these people have been depicted as climate refugees, and I just want to put this in because it's an interesting question. They've been often, their departure is explained by poverty, by the likes of the New York Times and Forbes magazine and what have you. But it's not clear to me that that's what is going on. So let me take you to Senegal and we'll get into that. The region of Tambacounda is in eastern Senegal. It's a dry land area. Most of you know, I won't spend time on that. The research was conducted by Papa Fai and myself. We did the typical sorts of methods, household surveys, in-depth interviews, participant observation. I've been working in the region for 35 years. Matt Turner joined us for a Niger study, but I won't talk about that. So access analysis that I use here very simply is you start by identifying the problem. That is always a normative issue, right? We talk about losses or gains. That's a problem. It's human. We then do what's called a theoretically informed progressive contextualization. Starting with that problem, we explain why it happened by building outward. Here, the problem starts for me at the point of decision to leave. And as you may know, the word crisis in Latin means decision. And so the decision in the face of a great risk of death or hardship that's ahead, or the great potential to gain, is a moment of crisis. Framing of the analysis of causality is also always normative. We choose our frames, and I'll go through that. Frames of analysis of causality usually have implicit within them certain relations that we are interested in understanding. Tracing of cause then takes place from that instance of crisis across space and time. I generate an analytic narrative from that. So are these really climate refugees? First thing you got to say is, it turns out the climate in the Sahel is getting better from everything we know. And it turns out the rainfall has been improving. Crops have been up and down as usual. And the Sahel is supposedly greening, according to many. So I don't think we can follow Thomas Friedman and others of the New York Times in their calling this a climate crisis, nor the advocates who, frankly, I think use the climate crisis and apply it to migration because xenophobia in Europe and the United States plays well. And so it'll turn people against climate change if you say that lots of foreigners from the South are going to come marching up to your border. So unfortunately, I don't think we can say that is the case here, nor in Latin America, where people are fleeing violence and the like. So farmers' view of climate, it's not the problem. They view it as normal background, as production, production in their crops is up and down as usual, and they don't see climate as a problem because it's not in their control. Other things are. Climate change, very few have heard about it. They don't talk about it. And one who did said to me, yeah, they told us things are going to get worse, and that he was feeling some anxiety about this. And that's probably true, but as a researcher, I'm in the present. I am in what they are experiencing, not what they will, despite that they are experiencing the present through these narratives, which is important. And this is not about denying climate change. Climate change is going to happen, and it is, in my mind, a forthcoming disaster in many ways. So that said, we found that 71% of the households in the area had somebody in the migration process. 53% had somebody who had arrived in Europe, and 2% had at least one member of the household who had died en route in the last 5 years. That's enormous. These are not trivial death rates. So how do we frame cause of risks and departure? What is the role of climate? Somebody who is typing has their mic on, so you might
Yeah,
want
can other people please mute their mic?
mute that, whoever that
Yeah.
is. So anyway, this is a diagram of impact analysis. It's your typical hazards frame. Climate events come along, and there are multiple outcomes of a single event, and they are caused by the climate. Causality is located up in the sky. A vulnerability analysis reverses that. Multiple causes of, you pick a single outcome, and that's a moral choice. You pick which outcome you're going to look at. Hunger and migration, which I combined here just because they are linked in this study. So you get multiple causes of a single outcome in a vulnerability analysis. Climate is at the margins of this. Climate modelers hate this. I work with them, believe me. I just finished a great article with a group of climate modelers up at Columbia University. And in fact, I think they got the vulnerability analysis, and really it was a productive exercise in thinking about why this is so hard to integrate in. So Amartya Sen basically locates causality of these outcomes in a political economy kind of vulnerability analysis in entitlement failure. Lack of assets, lack of social protections, lack of capabilities or capacities, that is. Inadequate democracy and capabilities, which in some sense are an overarching concept here. You know, other factors come in, climate fluctuations, market fluctuations, shape the system in which this unfolds. He leaves the lack of assets unexplained because he's a good neoclassical economist and initial conditions are given. I don't think they're given. Capabilities are sort of based on methodological individualism. They're very individualized. There are a set of assumptions within that. Climate is at the edge, as usual, or as in vulnerability analysis in general. Vulnerability analysis, a broader political economy approach, has to explain that lack of assets, okay? And we'll get into that. Relations of identity, exploitation, expropriation, political exclusion, all of the different factors that you would typically bring up trying to explain a crisis, poor infrastructure, market fluctuations, lack of representation and democracy, and access relations being identity and, you know, access to education that might in fact shape one's influence on the political economy, that shapes one's entitlements, right? As Michael Watts said, empowerment is the ability to shape the political economy that shapes entitlements, whereas Sen looked at a more narrow free media and kind of representation shaping that. So he didn't ignore that, but it was more within a narrower frame of analysis. So as I said, this explains initial conditions, explains capacities, social differentiated explanation as well. Climate is at the edge. So the Senegal story, what on earth happened? Why do farmers emigrate? What are their concerns? Weather is not mentioned. I already said that. Pervasive subsistence crisis is central to what they say. And what they say isn't all of what motivates them. We see that each sector leaves them below subsistence. We also see that the services that they might have once gotten are diminishing, including moral economy, sort of reciprocities and interaid. But you see it also in state services like veterinarian and medical services that are not being delivered, and that you go to the hospital, which is fully paid for by government, and you still have to pay market rates to get any service. So you have another situation, which is immigrants receive remittances, and so the society is getting split by this. You have families with and without remittances. They experience the hungry season differently. They withdraw from reciprocities, and there is jealousy, and you get situations where the families that have children want to marry their daughters off to families that have remittances. Okay, so the kids in the families without remittances can't come of age. The boys get older and older without marrying, while the 13-year-old girls in multiples are married off to migrants they never met. So 3 girls married to a migrant in Europe in a polygamous situation, boys who aren't married. What do you think they do? They get together. They have a good time. The girls get pregnant. Unfortunately, the families then break up. There are divorces. It's social dissolution of a certain sort and a kind of formation of class that's very contentious at the moment, the remittance and the non-remittances. These kids who cannot come of age can't also have roles in their families or the community. If someone dies in a family where there is someone who's migrated, the person in Europe who migrated will hear about the death before the person who's living there, the kid who's living there, because the person in Europe is likely to support and send money for the funeral. The kid who's working in the fields and working in the household is not seen as valuable. And as these kids say to us, things like, they treat us like the family mule. Nobody says thank you. And this is difficult. So precarity, and a sense of vulnerability, is another overarching situation. People feel angst about their situation. It really is a precarity in Bourdieu's sense. And you see this when you talk to kids who, I'm sorry, I keep calling them kids. These are 20-year-olds as well who might have children of their own who can't feed their kids. And in this situation, it's important to know that even before hunger arrives, even before migration happens, anxiety is already damaging people's sense of a valuable life. This is an important matter as well. Sense of disenfranchisement, that's another. Local and national representation. They don't feel they have any role in shaping the political economy that governs their lives. So why do these young farmers take a risk? They do express hopelessness. Barça wala Barsak, that means Barcelona or death, except they don't. Barsak really means that place between life and death, as you're waiting to know whether you go into heaven or hell. It's sort of a purgatory. But what they told me eventually, what I understood was that Barsak was not death in the Sahara. It wasn't death in the Mediterranean. It was social death at home. Okay? Constant anxiety, girls married to migrants, no dignified roles, being seen as not as valuable as the migrants. And so the non-migrant families feeling subordinate to a new class structure during the hungry season where they don't get the interaid, and the migrant families basically living better off. Okay, why young male farmers take risks too? Okay, I don't need to get into this. God will protect them, Barsa wala Barsak. They want dignity. That's the bottom line. Well-paying jobs. Europe seems like an option. They want to contribute to their families, and they want to be consulted at home, to have respect at home, to marry and come of age. I mean, it's actually very moving to talk to these young men. They are beside themselves. And this was not the case 35 years ago when I first arrived in Tambacounda. Youth did not have that sense. They talked about farming as difficult. They talked about wanting to go elsewhere, but there was very little migration from the region. So material deprivation and marginality are filtered through the above expressed expectations and feelings of marginalization. Emigration is a decision. And I say that because I used to poo-poo agency. I was much more in the structural. But it is clearly a decision within a condition with political economic causes. And that is the tracing outward from that moment of crisis or decision to why people are migrating. So I want to look at the material conditions very, this is like speed dating case study in cotton. These are cotton farmers in Tambacounda. I just liked his shirt. And these are the cotton buyers. Interestingly enough, you can't believe this, it's 95 degrees out. But Tambacounda, cold, hot is cold. It's relative. That was during the cool season. What you see in cotton is fixed prices and monopoly, one buyer, one cotton industry, debt on advances, collective debt, industrial subsidies from the peasant economy, which I, again, won't get into, but basically they pay a higher rate to the organized industrial cotton farmers who work as labor on the cotton farms than they do to the peasant farmers, because they have to, in fact, make it competitive on the international market, and the industrial farming is too costly because they actually have to pay a living wage. Most farmers are in debt at the end of the season in terms of the peasant sector. So that's cotton. Charcoal. These are images from a film I did on charcoal sector. Charcoal, you see fixed prices in an oligopsony, producer market. Producers make about $1,000 a year, a subsistence wage basically, but better than some of the farmers. And merchants make between $10,000 and $500,000 a year. I happen to know some are now making over $1 million a year. And this situation in forestry gets justified based on regulations that come out of scientific forestry that are specious nonsense. We could spend all day or all year on them. Re-centralization in the region, so they don't get decisions, even though decisions over forestry were supposedly devolved. They have stratified access to markets due to permits and licenses given by the Forest Service. Access to credit is limited because it comes from the merchants, who are the oligopsony buyers. Interlocking credit labor arrangements. Access to representation is also limited. And that is important because it is their representatives who ostensibly, according to the law, make decisions over forestry. Unfortunately, they don't get to. The Forest Service says it's a technical matter. That's the scientific forestry specious set of arguments. I could spend some time here, but I won't, on the structure of the charcoal markets. That is also part of the cause, and tell you about identity relations in the market, reciprocities in retailers and wholesalers, merchants and woodcutters, nobles and captives, the political parties, the unions, the religious brotherhoods that gain access to the permits and licenses. All this is part of it. And you know, I can convince you just by flashing this in front of you, but to get through the ways in which the elected rural councils are included and excluded, the regional forest service and the forest villagers would take more time than we have. But suffice it to say that this is overlaid by projects, by USAID, the World Bank, that supposedly are creating using the business model. They're getting rid of the quotas and now introducing contracts. Funny thing is, the contracts say exactly what the quota said: who can produce what, where. And they're also specified by the same people. The Forest Service has to approve them. That's the business model the World Bank introduced, the new quota system called contracts. You know, and discourses that overlay all this from forestry. Discourses like, look, here in the rule book, which you must obey, you have rights to the things that we don't take away, but we can't take the wood without taking the trees. So you'll have to make do with the stumps and some seeds. You can grow village woodlots, eucalyptus or pine. We'll help you to manage them through incentives and fines. If you listen, look, learn, and do as we say, even democratization will be on its way. We must protect forests from people like you so that people with business will have business to do. Now, if you don't think that is part of the production of poverty, I don't know what is. And the distribution, this is what I call a font scale distribution of income in the market. The merchants get 54% of the income, even though there's only 160 of them. Wholesalers, 22%, 100 of them. It's skewed within their categories. Retailers get 7%, that's 2,500 of them. And the woodcutters get, for the 11,000 woodcutters, 16% of the income in this market. That's the profit, not the income. And 3% of the profit goes to forest villagers for things like renting out houses, providing meals, and the like for the woodcutters. Now, some of them are entering woodcutting as well, but in this 11%, 16% profit category. They make very little. So what the general cases tell us, I'm wrapping up here. A Tambakunda access failure, what does it look like? Okay, that's just emigration as access failure. I see the hungry season and the lack of dignity as, in a sense, access failures. Damage is hunger, damage is anxiety. It's due to lack of access to many material resources, and it's due to hungry season and the lack of access to material and symbolic resources. I diagram it. This is a nice complicated spaghetti diagram. Hungry season is produced by low income, few assets, no social protections, destitution, caused in each of the sectors of production in the rural area by, and I can map this out, I'll map it out in a second, dignity. is really key, and the anxiety that it is related to. Class distinction, symbolic success in marriage, remittances. I've gone through all of these. Political exclusions are part of producing this. Administrative corruption, international donors are part of this. 12% of GDP that comes from migration is also part of structuring why migration is, let's say, encouraged by things like fixing the migration project through training supported by the World Bank and USAID of young people out there as car mechanics and tailors when there isn't enough clothing to tailor or cars to fix. So they get the training and then they go again to Europe. So, this is what I think the government would like. So, okay, I'm making a mess here, but cotton, oligopsony, maize, subsistence debt, millet, you get the point, right? It's complicated. But what I want to say is climate does play a role, and it will play a bigger role, and I'll isolate that role. So climate does have an effect on production. Right now it happens to be somewhat neutral. Warmer temperatures, more variation, but higher rainfall. And by the way, we've learned recently that higher rainfall is due to a disruption in the trends, where the great droughts of the 1960s to 80s were not natural. They were due to aerosol climate forcing of, I believe, the El Nino Northern Oscillation due to European aerosol production. Those great droughts. Climatologists are now attributing them to climate change. So the return to normal, which looks like an increase in rainfall, may in fact just be part of a bigger anthropogenic system. So what happens is climate events or trends also create the discourses that create anxiety. They also influence donors, funding of climate proofing, and the like. So that's just to isolate it and say it's part of the scene. And I'm struggling with how to balance this in that and how to think about the future. But it's something we need to think about. But the empirical analysis of causality in the present is what I'm on. So it doesn't look like your typical impact analysis, what I've shown you, right? This seems a little shallow at this point. This seems a little bit more elaborate, but it's also not telling us the whole story. So I am going to just hit escape. This is some migrants who made it to Europe and are sitting, a family, mom, dad, and the baby migrant. But I'm going to hit escape here so I can get back to my little postscript and hope I have not taken too much time with this. I haven't looked at the clock yet, but so postscript. In short, access theory allows us to think beyond rights, to empirically explore what determines distributions of benefits flows. It attempts to provide a complete analysis of causality, which is what ostensibly non-normative research is supposed to do. Of course, no research is non-normative. It is normative in defining of and choice of the object of interest, the problem, such as hunger or migration, which, by the way, can be in access theory and in an access analysis, both a benefit and a damage that we're looking at. In the choice of frames of analysis, it is also non-normative. The choice of an analytic frame, which, as we have seen, points us toward different causes and thus different conclusions. This includes different locations of responsibility and blame, liability, and different possibilities for response and repair. I think the access analysis gives us a broader set of possibilities. Don't know how yet to treat them, but it's something that when I have, been in a mode of response, working with the bank, working with AID, these sorts of things do come up. Representation becomes a key issue that might not be as important in another framework. So an analysis of access is an empirical approach whose purpose is to identify the ensemble of forces, legal, illegal, and non-legal, treatable or not, right? Empirical, scientific research is not about only what is treatable. It's about the whole picture. We look at proximate or distal, that means distant. And by the way, that word is used in the legal, critical legal studies, very interesting work on causality and blame and responsibility. Direct or structural kinds of relations. We look at them all that impinge upon any instance of benefit or benefit deprivation. But empirical analysis is always normative, and its choice of problems and framings are as well. And the challenge is to make the normative contents of our choices explicit, but to then move ahead and conduct our analysis with rigor. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Jesse. That was, tour de force, really holistic look at access and its so many different dimensions. And I'm really keen to hear comments, questions from the audience or from this group, because I think we're a very diverse group with different backgrounds. And I'd love to hear people's thoughts. So just either raise your hand. Okay, Mark, would you like to say
Well,
something?
I'll pile in first. Thank you very much indeed for that. I'm an ecologist with a great interest in the Sahel. I sit on the board of the Sahel Sahara Conservation Fund, and these are very pertinent issues. But in all your analysis, you don't mention once human demography. What has happened to human density and numbers over the period that you've been in the area? Because that must be germane in some way.
It is. In the area I'm working in, there has been an increase in population, but it is a land abundant area, rain-fed agriculture. So I tried to look into arguments that have been made that there is soil degradation going on. And this is something I need to look into more specifically. But that was not what people brought up in explaining why they leave. And in fact, interestingly enough, most migrants were from families who had had a good enough season to save up roughly $500, 200,000 CFA to depart. So they had had a good harvest. But I can't entirely answer your question. I can only say that there is out-migration to the cities, and this region does not appear to me to be, quote, overpopulated. That is not a term I would even want to use.
No, okay, fine. No, I wouldn't make a judgment about over or underpopulation, but do you have any figures to the increase in density of people over those years without being judgmental?
We do, and I don't have them on the top of my head. We did look at that at the beginning of the study, and I don't remember. It was not as drastic as I had expected. That's what I remember.
Do you remember something about just generally average size of land holding, or this kind of indication of availability of land?
No, I don't think size of land holdings has changed. in the area. There's really still quite an abundance of land. These are forest villages, and they expand into areas around them when they need more land. But actually, the last I looked at land cover, forest area was what was expanding, not agricultural land. There was a decline in agricultural surface. And sorry, but that was about 10, 12 years ago.
That's a common trend in many places with urbanization and migration and yeah, all of those dynamics.
Yeah.
Anyone else, or feel free to raise your hand or speak up or write something in the chat. No, I haven't seen anything there yet. I could ask a question about sort of the role of law. You know, you mentioned this distinction between legal, illegal, and non-legal. It attracts my attention because, as you may know, there's so much focus now in the EU and UK and other places, the US as well, on legality in supply chains as being sort of the solution. And I just wonder how useful are those distinctions? How do they, for one thing, address this issue of traditional or informal systems, which is maybe even institutionalized systems, so as distinct from, you know, non-institutionalized illegality. So where do traditional authorities or local authority come into that? To what extent do you see sort of the rule of law functioning in a correct way as being a solution? Or, you know, what is the role of sort of a pluralist approach to thinking about law?
Well, I think that one of the most remarkable pieces I have seen, I mentioned it in the beginning, I just read it, so it's fresh on my mind, is Christian Loon's new book, 9/10 of the Law. It is about legal pluralism. And of course, the question of land grabs and land security and the security of access to markets, they are legal issues in many ways, in that legality itself, law is an enforceable claim, that is, property is an enforceable claim, enforceable by law, custom, or convention. And these compete with each other, but different legal entities compete with each other. And that competition is, in fact, the production of authority, who can enforce. And so I see it as a negotiated kind of balance between different legal systems. And I see it as, for me, I mean, a judgment on what is better. I'm kind of more looking at this empirically. In Senegal, the customary systems of land allocation are still operating in the villages, partly because of the 1972 or 74 Land Act that basically made that all public domain. There's been new legislation that makes it possible to privatize. That's happening. And each time there's a transition, there are struggles. And those struggles lead to new alignments that become legitimate over time or contested. But I don't know how to answer your question, if I'm even getting at it, but the legal pluralism is part of the causal structure, as in who's enforcing what.
Yeah, well, I think because maybe because of in the beginning, when you laid out the sort of non-legal and illegal, it seemed you had a number of sort of examples of how this sort of undermines the law. I think if we're trying to look at, because I think ultimately this is sort of a talk about justice, right? And the implication, yeah, being that how can we think more broadly about how to improve access? I would think it's fair to say. So, you know, what role does the law play in this? What role, for example, does local government play in this? Because I know that's something you've written a lot about in trying to rectify what we have identified as problems. I mean, it's a normative statement, but I think we've identified problems. Yeah.
Okay, so this is a complicated issue and it has to be addressed place by place, and you don't want to impose changes that result in violence. So that said, it is my opinion that when there are elected local governments to represent people, that they should in fact have decision-making power over resources that are considered public in the local domain. Now, I was part of a group discussing a park in Myanmar, and this was in Myanmar a while ago, and the indigenous group was saying we should make all the decisions, the indigenous leaders, and basically there were half the population was not indigenous, but they'd been there for 5 or 6 generations. And I said, well, who represents them? And they said, nobody should. I said, nonsense. For me, that is just not acceptable. They need to be represented. In the area I work in, there are migrants from transmigration projects. There are migrants from Guinea who settle down for generations, become Senegalese citizens, and they may be favored or disfavored. So forms of belonging in terms of understanding representation are critical. And I divide that into 3 forms of belonging: residency-based belonging, which I call citizenship; identity-based belongings, which may be things like ethnicity, place of origin, religion, which tend to be subcategories of residency-based. And third are interest-based forms of belonging, like charcoal makers or merchants. And in the service of public resources, I would do everything in my power to put them, even if tradition says no, under elected local government, because I don't see why people should not be represented. And it seems to me that if the custom is so strong, then the elected local government who represents the people in the area who are an embodiment of that custom should in fact be representing the custom through or by dint of the relations of accountability that should be established in an electoral system, but often are not. And that's a second part of the answer to that question, which is much more elaborate and complicated to get into.
Thanks. Excellent. So I noticed that there are some more comments and questions in the chat. Tony Hill from ProForest, do you want to maybe ask your question or make your comment?
Let me find the chat.
Yeah, sure. I was just conscious that the access to mobile phones and the information about the outside world has transformed quite substantially since I started working in Africa many years ago. And I just wondered to what extent that's been a factor in raising expectations or lowering satisfaction with the lifestyle of previous generations for young men in Tumukunda and elsewhere, because I've seen that elsewhere in West Africa, where just the fact that you can see what Europe looks like, you probably see the best side of it, leads to undermines the satisfaction with the traditional lifestyle, the traditional forms of livelihood.
Well, my first answer to that would be to say that in 1914, in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, my grandmother found a magazine from New York, and she saw jewelry and kind of beautiful dresses and things like that. She migrated across Europe took a boat to New York, got off at Ellis Island, and worked as slave labor in the family of a cousin in Brooklyn. So I can't say that it's new that people see images of the rest of the world. They've been transmitted in many idealized ways that may even look better than what you see on a cell phone in the past in different times. And at the same time, people do talk about what they're seeing on Instagram, what they're seeing on Facebook, what they're seeing from Europe. That comes up, but it does not come up as a motive in the following sense. I have asked kids, who want to migrate, what do they imagine doing when they get to Europe? What is it they want to do to have fun? And they're like stunned by the question. They can't even imagine what would be fun. They're really talking about wanting a job so that they contribute to the family at home. I asked them, don't you want to go to the beach? In Tambakunda, they've never seen a beach in their lives. Don't you want to, don't you want to go to the dance places and find a girlfriend? And they're like, huh. So I'm not sure. I think some more work needs to be done on that. It's a plausible influence, but I'm not sure I really did try and get people to talk about it. And it didn't come up every day, but they've had a big effect on the price that people get for charcoal, for example, and for peanuts, because in the past they had to wait for a truck to come by. Truck would come by and say, well, I'll pay you this much. And they'd say, oh, that's not enough. And the truck would say, bye. And they knew that their product would rot or get wet as charcoal and not be good. And they would sell it. Now they call 10 different people and they're part of a network. Before, by the way, they were also it was the illegal producers that had that problem of not having a network. The legal ones who were also illegal, it's kind of legal, what I call the logical illogic of the legal illegal. They had permits and licenses, but they weren't citizens, so they weren't legal, that kind of thing. But they were in merchant networks. So they had transport, but the price had been fixed anyway. But the telephone has, I think, increased their income.
That's really interesting.
Might have made them stay longer.
Yeah.
And not
Access to markets.
Yeah, exactly.
So Jessica Thorne, would you like to say a few words?
Yes, hello. Thanks a lot for the really interesting presentation. I enjoyed it a lot. I'm curious, my question relates to the interlinkages between different rural and urban systems within your study site, in the sense of, I'm sure there's some movement between rural and urban centers and back to the rural centers, and between the urban centers and between the rural centers. And I'm currently conducting a study in northern and central Namibia on this topic, and those interlinkages are quite important in terms of how the resources are flowing, and then of course the much wider issues of assets and capabilities, etc., that you've been discussing. So maybe you could just give us some insight into that, and perhaps, I'm sure if that varies over time across seasons, especially in West Africa. I'd be curious to know more about that. Thanks.
Yeah, as mentioned, this study was inspired by the sinking of that boat off of Lampedusa. So we focused on the families of migrants who are going toward Europe. But there clearly is a seasonal migration. There are a number of migrations. Some people from the region are migrating up to the highlands up near the border of Guinea to do gold mining. Some are migrating as far as Guinea. Ghana, and not Ghana, Equatorial Guinea, and working in plantations. And others are migrating to the city, but there aren't that many jobs in the city. So they'll stay with their family and come back. And almost everyone has family in the city. Some are going to school, and the city being Dakar when I said it just now. Some go to Tambacounda to go to school. It tends to be more the girls and the young women who are going into the city than the young men for work and through families. But we did not do any quantitative work on that. Papa Phi has just completed a massive survey of the entire migration network. And I'm waiting to see that. He's being too diligent. He won't let me see it until the World Bank, who he worked for, says he's allowed to. So I have to be patient.
Great, thanks. Other questions? Shirley? Anyone else worked in Senegal or this region wants to say a few words? Not to be shy. Anyone here that's sort of used the theory of access paper to frame their essay or their paper or work?
No access theorists.
Yes. Well, I don't know, or maybe just yeah, not vocal ones at the moment. Yeah. Great. Well, so I hope people realize that this family in this picture is, and that sculpture that's been showing up is actually a work by Jesse. Do you want to say a few words about the sculpture, Jesse?
Sure. I was struggling with this. Okay, here's how I'll couch it, even though it's on a bench. Bruno Latour has become very popular amongst many people in Europe, especially. And he introduced actor network theory and flat ontologies. And to be honest, I find it nonsense. And he talks about distributive agency and the non-hierarchical nature between humans and nature. And I find that implausible because, he also says little things like, there's no such thing as theory, nothing is reducible to anything else. There's only the present and the presence of things present, presence of things past, presence of things future, which St. Augustine said well before him, and he doesn't cite St. Augustine. But bottom line being that I was pondering this question of human nature and the relation between humans and nature. And so I thought and thought and thought. I decided to make a sculpture that was just going to be rocks. I was going to make rocks. And I was going to make rocks because rocks are nature. They're the most fundamental sort of, just nature, right? And when I made them, they came out like this. I threw them on a potter's wheel, so they had a hole in them. I looked at them and they kind of did look human, but they were an attempt to make nature by a human. Therefore, I called them human nature. And voila, my rocks that are sitting on a bench, that are sitting in the desert and representing migrants for me, because I do think that in some ways, putting in images of people is in many ways takes too much of the attention. And so the rocks represented for me a way of talking about humanity without boiling it down to a single individual, but to some kind of an object of that breathes. And I don't think they're objects. I think humans are separate from nature. And I think there is, I go with hierarchical ontologies. And that also would require some explanation, but it simply means there is such thing as judgment. Judgment as in, I judge that studying famine is more valuable than studying grains of sand. I judge that having food is better than not having food. That is hierarchy. And it puts a value on distinguishing and not just mapping what is for the sake of mapping what is. In ant vector network theory. That is not a theory because there's no such thing as theory.
That's great. So Latour was actually maybe a spark or a catalyst for this artwork?
An irritant.
Yeah, irritant. Maybe that's
Yeah.
Yeah.
Look, he's contributed greatly to the thinking on social studies of science. His early work is brilliant. But I think much of his recent work is quite damaging by attempting to decenter agency, partly because my work on cause and blame in the Anthropocene is looking at precisely what critical legal scholars think of as the relation between agency and responsibility as it is linked by causality. And so if you say that causality is everywhere and agency is everywhere, then in fact, the climate is responsible for killing people and we should blame it. And that puts us back into calling disasters natural. And Neil Smith, who certainly didn't originate the idea that there's no such thing as a natural disaster. I think it was O'Keefe, Wisner, and one other back in 1974 in their article who talked about that. These are important things to keep in mind, that this is a long debate about how we account for events that are triggered by nature in terms of attributing human responsibility. Because when the dike breaks and the lower Ninth Ward in Louisiana floods, it wasn't Katrina that caused those deaths. It was the failure of the Army Corps of Engineers to maintain that levee because it did not value the lives of the people in that area. Despite not saying it didn't, it was well known that these dikes needed maintenance for a long time and they failed to do it. And even the federal courts found them guilty of causing the destruction in Louisiana. So call it a natural disaster, you're basically taking attention away from the human causality. And this is why I like the idea, based on theodicy, right, of sociodicy, that as humans, we must always explain pain and suffering by our location within a social network and society. And that is specifically, and most specifically, avoidable pain and suffering.
Sociopsy, yeah.
Sociodicy, yeah.
Sociopsy.
I mean, I use it tongue in cheek because, of course, Leibniz, talks about theodicy being the explanation of the goodness of God in the face of pain and suffering. How is God good if all this horrible stuff happens? Right? And so they create all these crazy ways of explaining the world. But I do think we can explain things socially. And I think it's important to do that when it is possible, because that is where responsibility lies. And this gets very complicated because causality is not just a linear, obvious thing when you enter the social, which is one of the other things I'm working on, which is why it is natural scientists have trouble with social causality. And it is partly because they cannot attribute causality to something that did not happen. Philosophers of science argue that something that didn't happen can't be a cause. But in society, because of the existence of what we call expectation, which is what builds society itself, all the social contracts, from moral economy to legal contracts to the state and our subordination to it, are expectations. And when something doesn't happen, we consider it causality, and we consider the result to be subject to liability because it was expected, right? Whereas that means those social contracts have to be part of the explanation whenever there was any possible different pathway that was in some way understood and known.
But don't we have a problem, though? I mean, given how well you've laid out the complexity of issues of access and access failures in, all the different areas of possible blame, in terms of what, who is most liable in, given the many sort of factors and actors involved in creating this vulnerability in the places that you were studying?
The complexity, I think, is visible. I think given the amount spent on trying to understand, what to do to put in a World Bank project, you could send a few good anthropologists out there and understand most of that complexity. I don't think that peasants don't understand a good deal of what they suffer. They also don't understand that it can be changed and accept much of it. Brings in Paulo Freire a little bit in terms of understanding the material conditions of one's marginality, right? But that's all part of a dialogue.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I think it's, and I agree, there's so much more that could be done to trying to understand other causes, these access failures, and certainly not attribute them all to climate. And then the challenge is how far sort of down or up the hierarchy of responsibility do you go, all the way to Europe, to, or to the charcoal merchant who is, has an unfair oligopsy or whatever it might be.
I think you go as a researcher all the way up the hierarchy. Yeah. And so, for example, when you're explaining this, you go to understand that the very conditions have a history. That history matters. It doesn't mean we can have reparations. So this gets into debates between Nozick and other people about what reparations are about, and how sometimes they're impossible, sometimes they're possible. But as a researcher, you lay out the full cause and then you start the debate on what to do about it. And this stuff is very, I am not a moral philosopher, and I have consulted moral philosophers to try and help me understand what I'm talking about here. But the current distributions are inequitable, and Sen was able to just say, with a consequentialist view, unacceptable, we must respond. What I'm saying is, yes, unacceptable, we must respond based on the consequentialist analysis of hunger, pain, suffering. However, if we explain why that is happening, we might come up with more possible solutions and more enduring solutions. And you can go back and look at the Haiti earthquake and trace it back to the Toussaint slave rebellion in the 1700s. The blockades that Europe and France made against Haiti to show that Haiti should be punished because Black people, according to France and the United States, who were slaves, Black people should not rise up. And this is what happens to you if you do. So they were punished by being blockaded. There were indemnities that took 80% of the gross domestic product of Haiti until the 1960s. Why is Haiti so poor that an earthquake killed 200,000 people when the same magnitude earthquake in San Francisco killed 45, 46? There's some reckoning to be done there. How we do it, I don't know. And in fact, clearly, the proximate immediate causes are the ones we need to deal with first, like building standards in Haiti, like enforcement. But we also need to think about why did they come to this state, and are there moral responsibilities elsewhere for supporting some kind of reparation? And reparation here really does mean repair, and repair for security. There are no answers to these questions. They're discussions. But I tend to think that these antecedents matter, and that's why I think calling it an access failure and linking it to a broader causal analysis is a way to go. Causing it an entitlement failure based on a consequentialist judgment and saying, therefore, we need to guarantee, is also productive, but it is not going to generate the same solution. Maybe. It may be that we find that the immediate causes that Sen identified are powerful and most effective, but we still need to be looking at them.
Excellent. Maybe just if I may, because I realize we still have 2 more minutes, and I'm if someone else wants to speak, please do. But I wonder if we could conclude by, I mean, now Jesse, you have over 15 years since you wrote The Theory of Access, and now you've got this access failures work that you're working on now. Do you want to reflect a little bit on how your thinking has changed over those years about access, or has it changed in any particular way? How has your theory evolved over time, I guess would be the question.
I think that the one element of access theory that has not been attended to by anybody, and to me is one of the more important ones, is that access theory actually, I'm not sure I can articulate this right now, but access theory enables us to move away from a relations of production class analysis to a stratification around means of access. And so there are those who maintain access and those who control access. And those form 2 different classes. But those who control access, in order to control access, must maintain their control of access through access to other means. And so it enables a multi-layered class analysis of society in explaining the distribution of and enjoyment of the benefits from things.
Great.
That to me would be a part I would like to see more work on, but I don't develop that in this reflection.
Okay. Well, thanks so much. Perfect
Thank you.
timing. Yeah, I mean, so many thanks for joining us and sharing your thoughts, and really a lot to process in this presentation, and all the thought and the art that you've shared with us. So thanks so much, and thanks to everybody for joining us.
Thank you,
And
Connie.
yeah, I hope this will be part of an ongoing conversation, as you
Very
say.
good.
Excellent.
Okay. Thank
Thanks.
you all, and be well.
You too.
Ciao.
Take care. Bye.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Connie. And-
Okay. Well,
Yeah,
that
just
was
the two of
great.
us. Yeah, did you record?
Yes, I did. So let me just, I'll end that now, I guess. Let's end this.
I would say